Good morning. I'm Jason Moore, chair of the Department of Computational Biomedicine at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in LA, and it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Kira Radinsky, our last keynote speaker of the conference. Dr. Radinsky was born in Ukraine and immigrated to Israel at a young age. Her scientific journey began at Technion Israel Institute of Technology, where she started her undergraduate studies at the age of 15. She completed her PhD there in computer science, focusing on predictive analytics using temporal information retrieval and natural language processing. Dr. Radinsky has made significant contributions to both academia and industry. Her pioneering work on predictive algorithms has opened new frontiers in anticipating geopolitical events and disease outbreaks by analyzing vast amounts of data from diverse sources. Notably, her research predicted the first outbreak of cholera in Cuba in over 130 years. She co-founded Sail.health, a company that leverages predictive analytics to improve sales performance, which was later acquired by eBay. Following this, she served as director of data science and chief scientist at eBay, where she led innovative projects that melded big data and machine learning to transform business strategies. In 2013, she was named one of MIT Technology Review's 35 Young Innovators Under 35, and in 2015, Forbes included her as 30 Under 30 Rising Stars in Enterprise Tech. In 2016, she was selected as Woman of the Year by Globes. Currently, Dr. Radinsky is CEO of Diagnostic Robotics, where she continues to revolutionize the healthcare industry by applying AI to predict patient trajectories. She also holds a visiting professor position in computer science at Technion, focusing on the application of predictive data mining in medicine. And for those of you joining us this morning on YouTube, please enter your questions in the chat and we'll have somebody read them at the end of the presentation. Dr. Radinsky, welcome.
So I want to take you to the time you were doing your PhD. Well, I can say that we were doing everything but our research. And one of the things we love doing is reading news articles and imagining some catastrophe. I don't know why we had one of these master students who was pretty sure the world is about to end. And specifically, he read the Mayan calendar that was ending in 2011. And he was trying to find almost any evidence possible to prove us that it is correct. And luckily for him, one day, 5,000 birds in Beebe, Arkansas, fall out of the sky, all dead, no signs of disease. For him, it was the sign of the end, or in other words, we need to publish our papers faster. At that time, I had access to everything people were searching on Google, of course anonymized. And I was looking at the trend, and I've noticed that people are indeed searching for birds' death much more than usual. But what caught my eye was not the fact that we're searching for it. It was the fact that it was not the first time. It happened before in Texas, Austin, it happened before in Norway and other locations. But the story doesn't end here for Beebe, Arkansas. And literally a few days later, 100,000 fish washed onto the shore, all dead, no signs of disease. When you look at how people are searching for fish death throughout time, and you clean the signal, you see a clear correlation. So many times when people are searching for fish death, they're looking for birds' death. But at that time, if you would look at the news articles, everybody was saying that this is a total coincidence. Animals just tend to commit suicide together. And this is where I decided to start trying to build a system to try to understand what was so unique, maybe a month before in the searches, 2 months before, 6 months, or a year before. So we went through all combination of words up to the length of 5, and we noticed that what was only statistically significant in those locations was the fact that there was a search for oil spills, much more than usual, 6 months before. And the reason this is surprising to me, well, if there's an oil spill now, I understand why fish and birds will die now. But why does it take 6 months? Why, when they found the fish, there was no sign of oil, no disease, nothing? So for me, I thought this is a major discovery. But when I consulted with my friend, she's a biologist, she said, well, everybody knows that. I said, well, enlighten me. She says, well, cause number 1 for fish death is oxygen depletion. Cause number 1 for oxygen depletion in the water is oil spills. And that's, in my opinion, the biggest problem that we have today in machine learning. We find a lot of correlations, but very few of them are causations. Why is that? So in this case, Neither one of you were searching for oxygen depletion in the water, so we could not even correlate it. So at this point, I started my journey trying to understand, can we mine all of this knowledge that we humans already have as causality? Like my friend, the biologist, she already knew this causality. How can we start using this inside machine learning models? At the end of this journey, I created a graph of 300 million nodes and billions of edges representing what we humanity know about causality. The way I structured it, I had access to 150 years of news articles, billions of tweets, millions of web searches. And at that time, we started taking sentences. So in this case, it's US Army bombs a weapon warehouse in Kabul with missiles. And we would apply natural language processing to know who did the action, in this case, the US Army, bombing, location is Kabul, instrument missile. How did we do it? Well, we had a lot of students reading a lot of sentences and actually writing it for us. And after 10,000 of those, we were able to train machine learning classifiers to do it for us. Today, of course, you have much more trained models and you don't need to do it yourself. We then started looking for cues that we humans use to convey causality to one another. For example, we would say this causes, before, after, as. So in this case, the author actually said this caused 5 Afghan troops to be killed. This process created our causality graph. At that time, I was working in Microsoft Research and collaborating with the Gates Foundation. And they asked us, can we use our causality graph to predict Ebola outbreaks? What's unique about Ebola outbreaks, well, they happen very few times in humans, but they happen dozens of times in animals. We looked at our graph and we noticed that in every one of those cases, it was exactly the same pattern. And what I love about this example, it sounds almost like a biblical story. It all starts when humans are becoming greedy and look for diamonds and gold. Our system knows when people are looking for diamonds and gold, deforestation will happen. Our system knows when deforestation happens, animals will migrate, but specifically, one type of animal, the bat. And indeed, the latest Ebola outbreak started with a 3-year-old child who ate an uncooked bat bushmeat, eventually killing more than 1,500 people. Well, at this point, we got really excited about the system. We said, like, oh my God, this system can predict things we cannot predict ourselves. Let's do a competition. Let's take a bunch of students and experts, see if they can read the news and make predictions, see what our system is doing, and wait 6 months and see who's right. But one prediction made me understand that there is still something missing in our system. Well, the system read the following news article: a nuclear physicist was killed in Iran. If you ask people, they would say, like, oh, a war will start, UN will blame United States and others. A lot of conspiracy theories. You know what? It happened in the past. Nothing happened because of that. But what the system predicted not only happened, we even found the news article talking about it. The system predicted that there's going to be a funeral, which all makes sense. But this is not why we took 150 years of news article for the system to tell us things which are pretty obvious. And why did the system do it? We train it on things that authors are writing that A causes B. In other words, obvious things. So where can it surprise us? Only when A causes B, causes C, causes D, right? Things which is really hard for us to connect. And then we said, maybe we can unite both theories. In other words, the traditional machine learning approaches of finding correlations in our causality graph and identify some path where A causes B, B correlates with C, C causes D, and try to identify and actually write to the user what caused what and what correlated. So here, the way we started, we identified that some floods and storms cause cholera. How did we identify it? It was written all over the news for the last 100 years. Not very surprising, cholera is a waterborne disease. But you would all agree that not all storms or floods will cause cholera. What we asked the system to do is try to identify what is so unique about those floods they do. And the system identified that in all of those, 2 years before, the word drought appeared in the news articles. It was based on around 6 cases in Angola that happened since 2006 till today. 100% of them had exactly this pattern. In Bangladesh area, since the 1960s till today, 19 significant cases of cholera, more than 80% have this pattern. But this pattern doesn't happen in many other locations. It doesn't happen in Germany, doesn't happen in Israel, doesn't happen in the United States. So what is so unique about Angola and Bangladesh? You might be thinking to yourself, well, probably those are poor countries, right? Some people would say, well, they have poor sewage system. I'm going to urge you to think, where did you get that knowledge? How do you know that Angola and Bangladesh are poor countries? Did you check their GDP lately? This is exactly what we humans have as world knowledge. We probably read it in some encyclopedia, we heard it in some news article, I don't know, we don't even remember where we got it from. The problem is our system did not have access to this data. So if it cannot, it treats the cases in Angola and the cases in Bangladesh as separate cases and could not abstract and identify this as similar patterns happening time after time again. So we started giving it access to word knowledge. One of the largest data sets was Wikipedia, but we have different hundreds more. And we let the system think about hypotheses. Is it happening in areas with certain population density, ethnic groups, government types? It goes through each one of them and tests them statistically. Only 2 were statistically significant. The first one is GDP, you all guessed correctly, probably poor countries, bad sewage systems. But the other one is what got me surprised, the percentage of water. It turns out if they have low percentage of water, the probability of this outbreak is higher. And why is this surprising for me? Because it's a waterborne disease. I thought that if you have a lot of water, it will spread quicker. In April 2011, our system is scraping the news and sees the following news article coming out from the BBC about a significant drought in Cuba. Our system starts alerting about the possibility of a cholera outbreak for in the next 2 years. What do? We ignore it. Why? Well, more than 100 years, no cholera outbreaks in Cuba. We're still building a system, afterwards a probabilistical system. We completely forget about it. But in August 2012, our system doesn't forget, and this time catches the second stage of the same pattern, because it identifies floods and storms that are coming in next to Cuba. It alerts about the cholera outbreak with a much higher probability. We have discussions with the Gates Foundation to send clean water and aid to all those locations, and indeed, in January 2013, it's the first cholera outbreak in Cuba in 130 years. Now, cholera is a disease that kills 100,000 people every year. But if you get clean water in time, the mortality rates drop from 50% to less than 1. But, aid organizations don't need 2 years alert. So many people will change in those 2 years. So 3 months is just enough. But what this pattern helped us understand, there's something in the weather that correlates or causes, who knows, this cholera outbreak in Cuba. So what we did, we contacted the World Health Organization. We asked them, can you give us all of the cases of cholera that you encountered since the 70s? We received this data. We then contacted different airports. They have information about weather on an hourly basis. And we started building machine learning models only based on this data, trying to predict cholera outbreaks 2 to 3 months ahead. And we reached 94% accuracy. But this wasn't a system to predict cholera outbreaks. This was a system that would receive a sentence in free language and predict the probability of this text to appear in the news in the next 6 to 12 months. So for example, we've been working with the UN to try to predict different riots. One of them that we were able to predict is the Sudan riots at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014. The system identified the following pattern. If you have a subsidized product and you stop subsidizing it, people are going to go to the streets, but specifically students. If one of those students gets killed by the police, you're going to have much major riots. This is exactly what happened, for example, in Egypt. You have a subsidized product, in this case bread. One of the people goes, puts himself on fire, students go to the streets, major riots for 3 weeks, and eventually they change the government. Very similarly happened in Sudan. Gas prices were subsidized, they stopped subsidizing them, people went to the street, major riots, a 30-year-old gets killed, and more than 3 to 4 weeks of riots. But this pattern doesn't happen in other locations, right? Occupy Wall Street, remember, right? People are very angry, I don't know if there's even something subsidized, right? In Israel, we had the same thing, we had cottage price, they stopped subsidizing them, we had 2 million people in the streets. We really love our cottage cheese. So what is so unique about countries that this happens versus ones that it doesn't happen? So the system identified the following. If the average salary is not adapting, but the amount of money coming in to the country is growing, only then this pattern happens. Why? I don't know, this is something that we all need to decide why. Maybe it's corruption, because if there's a lot of money coming in, why is the average salary not growing, right? And maybe a big difference between the poor and the rich, who knows, right? But what I love about this is it's almost mathematically concise. Another work that we've been doing was trying to predict genocides, a killing of 10,000 people or more by a majority in a certain country. Again, a collaboration with the UN. What the system identified was the following pattern. If you have somebody important in a country, or the way our system defines important, if they have a Wikipedia page, and if they call a minority in that country in one of two words, cockroaches or mice, that's all you need. In 3 years, the probability of genocides quadruples. When we work with sociologists, they explain us this is the process of what they call dehumanization, is when the majority starts believing the minority is not human and then carries out the atrocities. But all of this work got me thinking, can we start applying all of this information and replace us as scientists? Because what we do as scientists, if you think about this, we think about a hypothesis. If it works, amazing, you can even get a Nobel Prize, right? Can we start building those AI systems who just take all of our knowledge, think about hypotheses with high probability, and only then we can test them? Now, I wasn't the first one who was thinking about applying AI in the population health field. One of the first ones was Google. Google was trying to identify flu before it happened. The way they've done it, they were seeing if somebody's searching for the word flu, and if millions of people are searching for the word flu, there's probably a flu outbreak. Very simple, but they were able to predict flu outbreaks 3 to 4 weeks before HMOs or health organizations even realized it was happening. Until one day, millions of people go on online and search for the word flu, and they have no flu. Or the way Nature wrote it, when Google got flu wrong. So why would millions of people search for the word flu and no, nobody read the science paper before? Remember the swine flu. So people were anxious about swine flu, not because they had the flu, but just heard about some mysterious disease that can harm them. And again, we touch on the fact that the difference between correlation and causation. All those systems are amazing, but applying them in production is very problematic unless you understand that it's a decision support system as opposed to a cause-effect system. But it doesn't mean that all those systems cannot bring value. So this is a nice work from Elad Yom Tov and Gabrilowicz, published in JMR in 2013. What they were trying to see if somebody's searching for a certain drug on the web, and then the same person searches for a certain side effect a few days later, and they would record it. So they had access to query logs coming in from Microsoft, and every time somebody would search for a medicine, a side effect, another person, if they all searched for the same side effect approximately the same time after they searched for the medicine, they would assume it's a side effect. They were able to show that they're identifying side effects of drugs like Effexor. They identified that you first start feeling nausea in the first week, and then 2 weeks later, you start feeling sleepy. So all those systems are really good in order to identify candidates for hypothesis. I don't know if verifying them, but at least identifying them. In my work, I started collaborating with different HMOs. One of the largest HMO in Israel had access to 4 million patients' data for 20 years, all structured, lab tests, doctor visits, prescriptions. And they asked, can we start using these machine learning algorithms in order to identify which combinations of drugs we should give to patients? For example, in hypertension, nobody quite knows what's the right protocol of doing it. The protocol right now, just to simplify it, is, well, try this drug. If it doesn't work, try this drug. Oh, it doesn't work. Okay, try another one. So it's almost experimentation. And the question is, after 20 years that we've done experiments on humans, why can't we use this data in order to identify the right combinations? So that's what exactly we've done, and we identified very quickly certain combinations of hypertension drugs that are more suitable for some patients as opposed to others. But while we were doing it, we started identifying other more important things. We started seeing that patients who are taking a specific type of drugs, their blood pressure drops, although those drugs were not even for blood pressure. For example, we identified that patients who are taking PPI, it's mostly if you have digestive problems, right? Their blood pressure drops. We couldn't understand what was happening. We even did a small clinical trial and verified that in a treatment control group. One of the primary care physicians I've been working with said, okay, amazing, I'm gonna spend like 2-3 weeks doing literature research. and came back and said, well, the reason is probably those patients are sleeping better, right? If they don't have the digestive problem, they sleep better, their blood pressure drops. Amazing. But the problem with this approach is we had so much spurious correlation. My favorite one was the following. If you're using liquid soap as opposed to regular soap, your blood pressure will drop. Well, we all agree that using liquid soap for treatment of hypertension is probably not the right thing to do, but it turned out it correlated with age. Younger patients use liquid soap as opposed to older ones. So we were thinking, if we want to operationalize the system, how can we reduce some of those spurious correlations? So what we did, we tried to mimic what this primary care physician was doing. Can we take all of the medical articles published and try to build explanations? Because if we can build explanation and it resonates, then the researchers working with us will feel more comfortable moving into clinical trials. Our explanations look the following. If there's a correlation between statins and hypertension, the system will go to different articles and try to build the explanations and link to those articles. For example, it identified that statin is related to cardiovascular disease, it's related to RAS, and this one is related to hypertension. So the moment it could understand and explain the correlation, we thought that at that point we would feel more comfortable to move to more causation. Using this methodology, we identified that beta blockers are highly correlative and might even cause Parkinson's after 14 years of usage. How did we do it? So in general, beta blockers, as opposed to ACE inhibitors and others, the way they work, they sit on channels, they block the channel, make the veins wider, and then blood pressure drops. But what the system explained us is, well, once you do it, probably different things are trying to sit on those channels. They're not available, trying to create Lewy bodies, and that eventually deteriorates the different neurons in the body. The system identified it because it was using a large corpus, identified the correlation, and gave us some explanation. What's cool about this explanation is also that asthma drugs, which are doing exactly the opposite of beta blockers, when we did experimentation of mice, we saw that it reduces the probability of Parkinson's as well. Well, everything I showed you right now was pretty cool, but I pretty much showed you existing drugs, and I showed can we use them in different ways. One of my PhD students said, well, how about we use machine learning to create a new molecule? So the way we've done this, we started applying deep learning models. We would actually take molecules, represent them as text. There is an entire discipline of how to do it. It's called Smiles notations. Apply, at that point, we're using variational autoencoders, but you can use any form of generative model, and then produce a molecule that we think is a high probability of connecting to another molecule or a protein, etc. And then we did an experiment. We took everything we knew about molecules developed till the 30s, all the drugs, etc. And then we asked the system to generate 1,000 molecules and see maybe one of them passed the FDA after the 30s. We thought it was going to be a really cool title, the drug that could, right? That we could have discovered if we had this AI system in the 30s. But what we identified is that we had 35 drugs out of the 1,000 that the system generated correctly and passed the FDA after the 30s. One example, the system took a drug called persnimmide. It went to the market in the 30s for tuberculosis. Unfortunately, it was toxic. It made several changes to it. Almost 60% of its structure was changed and created a new molecule today known as ozanazide. It's the #1 drug for tuberculosis today, and it went to the market in the 50s. In other words, all of the knowledge we needed in order to identify that this #1 drug we already had in the 30s. It was just really hard to discover. Well, so I showed you really cool stuff. Everything is retrospective. I want to show you how we actually generate new things, and we tested them on monkeys and apes. But before that, quick background. You all remember mRNA from the COVID vaccine. Very important, can actually treat a lot of diseases if you get it to the right cell. So one of the biggest problems we have today in mRNA is targeting. If I would actually visualize it, think about this almost as building a space shuttle. The actual mRNA, just to give you a background, in the COVID took 2 days. So think about this as the astronaut. The actual shuttle, it took 20 years to develop. We're so lucky we could actually use it. So what do we use today as shuttles? You use viruses. You take out the inside of the virus, you put in your mRNA, you put it in the body. Some viruses that, I don't know, 1 billion years to develop the way of getting to the brain, right? What's the problem? The body doesn't like viruses, and couldn't it be really awesome if we could use things that the body does love, like fats, in order to create those shuttles? So that's what we've done. We thought, hey, can we learn from viruses how to get to the brain, but instead of creating a virus, creating it using LNPs? So what we had to do for this, first of all, we had to scrape all the literature. Why? Because we needed to train a machine learning model. Turns out, all of those scientists are not writing papers for us to actually read using AI. So we actually used to have almost image processing on like this mice pictures and understanding that it's the lab and then structuring all of it. Everybody publishes graph, nobody's publishing the actual structured data behind the scenes. So there was a lot of work to automate that process. What we then did, we had this database. Some of this was manually corrected by some of our students. And we started building machine learning models, actually ranking different molecules that we could produce in the lab, and then moving them into mice experiments. What we then also needed to do, we could not generate things which have patents on. So what you see here is a representation of existing drugs. Here I was trying to do it in 2D, and you can see actual clusters of different companies. What you see in blue is the molecules I'm going to show you. We actually started a company coming out of those molecules as well. So eventually, we had a space of 100 million molecules. We cannot produce them all in the lab because chemists can only produce a very small portion. They didn't have enough time. We didn't have all the materials. So we were only ranking around 100,000 of those. The machine learning model was trying to predict, in this case, what would reach to the liver but have low toxicity. What you see here, MC3 on the top, that's the state of the art, something that took years of development. The ones in the bottom, MB and MB222, are things that the machine learning actually produced, and you see they're reaching the same results as MC3. We're talking about 1 week cycle. You're probably thinking maybe everything reaches to the liver. So what you see here is molecules that ranked low did not reach to the liver as well. From that point on, we started developing those things not only to the liver, because liver is a little bit easier because the body, the way it works, the liver gets everything inside. But how do you get to the lungs? For the lungs, most of the time you get it from breathing. How can you get something from the bloodstream? So the system developed already things for the kidneys, for the lungs, for the brains, and I'm talking about the less of year of work. But everything I've been showing right now, I think it will take a few years, around the 10 years, to actually start getting to the market, because you need a lot of experimentations about that one. But in my opinion, we have a much bigger problem today. We have till 2030 to get to a point where we scale our primary care, because till 2030, we're going to have almost 4 billion people without access to primary care. What that actually means, if today people in the United States are waiting 3 hours on average inside the emergency department, people today in China are already waiting 8 hours on average, right? So we don't need to make a lot of predictions in order to understand that we need to start scaling some of these processes. This is a project that we started almost 10 years ago. The idea that we had was, can we actually build AI systems? We first started inside the emergency departments and then scaled into primary care. The idea here is, while a patient is waiting inside the emergency department, the system will ask questions, triage the patients, and automate all of the sending all of the blood test work. If we need a specialist, call them in, and do a lot of this operation behind the scenes. We then, as I mentioned, started scaling this to primary care. So today, this system is treating almost 5 million patients. The way it works, before you actually schedule an appointment with a primary care physician or a specialist, you go through the system, it's asking you a set of questions. If it predicts that the patient has UTI, it pre-orders a test. You can do it at home, and then your physician will get to their EMR a text or any form of alert saying that this patient, this is the results. You should approach to it in the next 3 to 4 hours. But what I actually want to talk to you about, not why it's working, but why it was so hard to make it work. But again, very quickly, how the system, we envision it working. A patient intake, an AI system predicting the urgency of the patient, which test needs to be ordered, and then creating doctor dashboards, creating, at that point, it was very simple generative AI, producing medical summaries and alerts. So why was it so hard to actually build it? So the way we built it, we had a lot of access to EMR. We had 20 million different EMRs, medical summaries. We started applying, this is one method, since then we developed additional ones, of trying to extract, given a question that our physicians wrote, that is a triage question, trying to extract it from a medical summary. So for each patient, I have the answers to their questions, and then correlating it with an answer that the patient gave. Behind the scenes, we started building machine learning models, trying to predict for combinations of the answers, what the physicians have done historically. Very nice. We started seeing really high results that eventually, if you compare it to other systems, the type of data that it's producing is very high. But one of the problems that we had in the data is you cannot just apply simple machine learning behind the scenes, because many times it would say things like, well, the patient doesn't have a flu, right? So we needed to build a negation system. How do we build a negation system? Because the language is so different from natural language, we again had to write a lot of sentences, take them from medical summaries. We had 100 interns, medical interns, actually writing if A is negated by B. We finished doing that, we got to almost 99% accuracy. But then we started seeing other problems. Again, those medical summaries are not written for a computer. They're written for physicians to communicate one another. So many times we would get sentences like, the patient was admitted with hypertension along with accompanying conditions. What is accompanying conditions? The machine learning model needs to know what conditions we're talking about, right? So in this case, probably meant tachycardia, right? And again, what we needed to do at this point, we asked we could not just create a machine learning model out of this type of text. So our interns would actually write what they understand that the machine learning meant, and we had the machine learning model produce the missing entities before we pass it to another classifier to actually produce the results. So the way it was doing it, it was taking text and trying to generate probabilities of different missing entities. But one of the biggest problems is correlation versus causation, as I mentioned before. Why? Because if you just rely on correlations, you're going to have 50 questions you need to ask the patient, and patients will not answer more than 8 to 13. So just to show you a quick correlation that we've seen in the EMRs, we see that psychiatric patients are more likely to suffer from Parkinson's disease. However, this is wrong, because Parkinson's is a side effect of some of the psychiatric drugs. And we're thinking to ourselves, can we take everything I showed you before with those causality graphs and this time apply them to healthcare so we'd know when A causes B and help us reduce the amount of questions that we're asking? So how did we do it? We would extract from medical articles if somebody wrote A causes B. Once we've done it, we were actually, to eliminate all of the errors we have in natural language processing, we would look at correlations of our EMR, and if there's a correlation and somebody said that A causes B, we'd assume it's cause and effect. So how does it work? Very quickly, we'd actually see sentences that look like malabsorption was found due to celiac disease, and then we would write celiac disease causes malabsorption. That's how our graph looks like. And then what I wanted to do is filter some of those if I couldn't find a correlation to them in our EMR data. So once we did both the correlations in the EMR and the text-based graphs, we were able to boost by almost 2 times the accuracies of our health graph, which we used in order to identify which triage questions to ask the patients. Amazing. We felt so good. Our AUCs in the machine learning models were almost 95. Seriously, super high numbers. We went to our first prospective trial, and we got an amazing random result. In other words, an AUC of almost 50. How come? How come in retrospective data everything looks amazing, but then when we applied it inside the emergency department, it was so random and bad, right? Let me give you an example. It turns out that all of the patients came in with a chest pain, and they said that they have a constant pain in the chest. How many times did the physician actually document constant pain in the chest? Any guesses? 20. 60% of the time, the physician did not agree with the patient and said that the pain comes and goes, or 20% the pain disappeared. Let me give you another example. 21% of the patients who came with a chest pain said that the pain radiates to the left. How many times did the physician agree with them and actually document that? Guesses? It's not 100%. 5%. Now, it's not because physicians are not listening. They're just not agreeing, okay? I'll give you the simplest example. If by the book you need to ask a patient, is this the worst headache of your life, right? Because you need to know if it's a stroke, right? All the patients inside the emergency department with headaches will tell you it's the worst headache of their lives. This is why they came to the emergency department, right? So what physicians understood, they don't need to ask it by the book, they're gonna ask it differently. Does it feel like an elephant stepping on your head? Does it feel like lightning hitting your head? And you only get it by experience. The problem is, we trained our machine learning models on medical summaries that physicians wrote after they already asked the questions in a different way from the patient, and our system was almost asking it by the book. So we had no other choice but to perform a prospective trials. At that point, we did it with Mayo Clinic for more than 2-3 years, till we got to a point where the medical summaries we produce and the medical summaries physicians are writing, they look the same. Only when we've done that, we could start applying our machine learning models to start making the predictions. So the first work we've done was with an Israeli hospital called Rambam. We had almost 1 million ED visits, out of them 30,000 headaches. I'm going to show you the example of headaches. Everything is pretty much the same. What we're trying to do is actually rank the different differential diagnoses. And we see that 80% of the time, the first one ranked was the correct one. 93% of the time, either the first one or the second one were the correct one, and the third, you already got most of the diagnosis correct. So usually I like giving examples just to show you a little bit why it's hard. So this is a patient, he's 25, he came to the ED with a history of 2 weeks of left-sided frontal and periorbital pain. The patient reports stuffy nose and 1 episode of vomiting right before referral to emergency department, rules out fever or head trauma, rules out previous similar events. Pain worsens when bending forward. The patient tried OTC painkillers, no improvement, no recent antibiotics. So what our system was actually doing, it was producing probabilities. So in this case, it predicted with high probability that is sinusitis. It gives explanations why. Cold and stuffy nose, headache worse when leaning forward. What makes it believe it might not be sinusitis in this case is the fact that pain relief did not help and the fact that it was vomiting. What we understood in this first experiment is that working with physicians and showing them probabilities is not the way they really understand it. When you show them 65, in my opinion, if you look on the right, you see sinusitis is 43 times more than the average. I was like, oh, it's amazing. It's like 43 times, it's much more. But for them, 65 is not 100%. If it's not 100%, it's not a good diagnosis system. So what we learned is instead of showing probabilities, which is a very abstract term and hard for people which don't have too much time on their hands to think about, we'd show them what's it like times the average. So in this case, what's the relative probability? 43 times more than the average. Here's another example. You have a 35 otherwise healthy male. He came to the ED 5 days, history of left-sided sharp temporal headache. Each episode lasts for about 5 hours. The pain is accompanied by some eye pressure, sensation, pain, lacrimination. The patient reports yellow discharge from the eye, no fever, antibiotics, and others. So what the system is doing, if you look at this, from a probability perspective, it's 50% cluster headache. Why? Lacrimination, pain or discomfort around the eye. But if you look at the relative probability, it's 99 times higher than the average. So this one actually helped us rank this in a way that physicians are using. One of the feedbacks that you used to get for this one is like, oh yeah, but you trained it on some hospital in Israel. Oh yeah, you trained it in Mayo. We have completely other patients. So what we're trying to do is, can we apply this system to a completely different population, very healthy ones in Singapore? Why Singapore? I don't know, we had a collaboration with them. They gave us access to 100,000 soldiers, and they gave us access to their data, and said, like, apply the same models that you already built. So what I want to show you is, when we started applying our model, it behaved almost the same. So this is, for example, for sinusitis. What we also saw that for soldiers in Singapore, they didn't have a lot of specific diagnoses, that when you train it inside emergency departments, you see much more. And then COVID hit, and we were requested by the Ministry of Health to start deploying the system to all of the hospitals. What they asked us to do is, can we use this type of questionnaires to predict where COVID is right now, but more than this, how it's gonna spread? Why? They wanted to start sending COVID tests to all of those locations to stop the spread. So how did it work? Every day, people would get a text message asking them, first in free text, because we didn't know what COVID is. We didn't know what were the symptoms, right? Can you describe the symptoms that you're currently having? We then would receive the information coming into the hospital of whether those patients deteriorated or not, and we started building dashboards for all of the nursing staff, saying, here's a patient, what's the probability of having COVID, and should they be sending them to a COVID test? The things we started discovering with time were pretty amazing. Everything you see here in these columns is different cities. What you see is certain cities where the government already knew that they have a lot of COVID spread, but they had almost 2 times more because they didn't have enough COVID tests in those locations. So what we would do is, instead of telling them, here's a patient, you need to send them a COVID test, we'd tell them, here's a city, you need to start sending those COVID tests to those cities so they can actually send it to those patients. So in April 4th, 2020 was the only time we could publish in the media the names of the cities that we thought were going to have much more COVID than usual. Again, there were cities that always had COVID, so I'm excluding those because everybody knew about them. And around 2 days later, they actually checked, and indeed those cities had much more COVID than they expected. And all of the HMOs and the Army started sending COVID tests based on this prediction system. We then started expanding it in the United States, in Rhode Island, in India to almost 50 million patients and others. But for me, what it allowed us to do very early on to identify different symptoms of COVID that we didn't know before, because they were not in the COVID triage. For example, what do we know about COVID? Fever. We knew almost 4 days after the outbreak started in Israel that loss of smell and taste is highly correlative, and even extreme fatigue. Behind the scenes, we had combinations of different symptoms. So for example, we knew that dry cough and sore throat is much more indicative than just fever. And what we've done, we started sending those type of insights. So there was a committee writing the triage, and based on that triage, deciding who can have a COVID test and who's not, because we didn't have enough at the beginning. And based on that, they started creating iterative triage protocols. Well, everything I showed you right now was when a patient has a problem, how can we automate it, how can we do it faster? But I started from the fact that we have 4 billion people without access to primary care. Well, continuing to do the same stuff but automating it is just not gonna get what we need. And this is why for the last, I would say, almost 7 years, I've been very much focusing on preventive care. In my opinion, the problem in preventive care, or how it's executed today in the States, is focusing on very sick patients. If you look at all of the algorithms, they look at who's expensive, they try to have care management team call them up and, I don't know, convince them to be healthier, do other stuff, right? It's very hard when patients are too far along. What we were trying to do instead is change this paradigm, saying who will be expensive, but can still be prevented with certain next steps now. So in this case, predicting that this patient will have a back surgery, identifying the driving cause. For example, if it's obesity, we'll send them to a weight loss program. If it's depression, sending them to behavioral health intervention. So how did we do all of that? So first of all, let me define the word preventable. Okay? There was a very nice study in Kaiser where they've seen in all of the emergency departments that only 30% of those emergency department visits are preventable. Why? Some patients are sick, they already need to be in the hospital. 35%, it's unpredictable, one-time catastrophic events. And the question was, how can we predict only those preventable ones? In JAMA 2007, Beth Israel was one of the first to try to take ICD-9s and 10s and manually categorize them to non-emergent, primary care treatable. In other words, could it have been prevented or not? They did a lot of prospective trials for almost 10 years. And they saw that their categorization actually correlates with deterioration of patients, readmissions, and death. Since then, really, a lot of progress in this building of ontologies. So for example, in 2018, the algorithm you see in the middle coming in from Mayo, they said, only look at the diagnosis inside the emergency department is not enough. We also need to look at the procedures. And they built an algorithm looking at both diagnosis and procedures to know if it could have been prevented or not. So what we started doing is taking all of those ontologies. We've obtained access to 60 billion claims. And we labeled all of those episodes using these ontologies to hear all the events that could have been prevented. And now, what we started doing is trying to predict, using machine learning, only those preventable events. So how did we do it? We had a clinical team, they started reading literature, like literally different hypotheses that somebody tested at some point of why patients deteriorating. We would add them as features into our machine learning models. Some of them are things like Charlson comorbidity score, how sick the patient is, right? Treatment compliance score, how well they're using their drugs and how adherent they are. But then we couldn't think about everything, right? So we started building deep learning representations from the diagnosis, the patient's medications, the procedures. We would look at all of the historical visits of a patient and trying to see if in the next 6 to 12 months, they're gonna have a clinically preventable event based on the previous definitions I showed. The problem is they had no idea what to do with it. Imagine this amazing call to some patients, hi, we think you're going to be sick because an AI told us, we just don't know what to do with you, maybe you'll tell us, right? So it didn't work really well. But what we understood is we really need to give the next step. We really need to suggest something to do with those patients. So the first question that comes to mind is, why not do exactly the same thing with everybody? Because this is what they've been doing for the last 20 years. So let's see this example. This is coming in from a local peer, one of the regional peers in one of the states here. They had a depression program, and they were trying to apply it to all chronic patients like AFib, COPD, and dementia. You see, if you treat the depression of patients, the probability of preventable inpatient visit actually drops from 5 times more to only 3 times more for AFib patients. For COPD patients, it drops from 4 times more to only 3 times more. But for patients with dementia, it has no impact, which makes sense, right? What does have impact for patients with dementia? If you actually assign them a primary care physician and you increase the amount of meetings. The question is, here I looked at only one parameter, which is the diagnosis. How can I look at all of those parameters, those thousands of parameters, and create this profile? So what we started doing, studying what we call causal inference. I'm just showing here one model, but intuitively, I want to find a similar patient historically, look at all of the things physicians have done with them, and see whether it had impact on their preventable inpatient visits, for example. So what this algorithm is doing is building embeddings of patients and calculating what we call individual treatment effects. With or without this treatment, did they have a difference? And we rank them, and for each patient, we would give the best next step that we saw historically. In my opinion, this is supposed to be almost the next frontier of what we need to do in machine learning, especially in healthcare, when we actually need to drive more to causality as opposed to just correlation. So I just want to show you how this system actually worked in practice, and then I'll open up for questions. So this system has been evaluating almost 28 million patients monthly. And here are the prospective results for predicting emergency department visits. We had 2 groups of care management, one of them working on the way they worked before, mostly focusing on expensive patients, transition of care. Our system was trying to predict who will do an avoidable emergency department visit and suggest next step. Most next steps were, hey, meet your primary care physician, pretty much like introduction meetings. That was almost the best next step. We're able to reduce the number of avoidable ED visits by 3 times, and the number of paid amount on average on those patients by 4 times as well. So this is healthy commercial population. How about chronic patients? So this is the same thing for CHF patients, trying to predict preventable inpatient visit. So instead of calling a patient that has CHF, COPD, and AIDS and asking them, did they ever consider dietary consulting, after 15 years of having this disease, we would call patients who literally were just identified with CHF and had 1 ED visit. They're just not controlling it. They don't know enough. So this small thing just reduced by 2 times the number of hospitalizations and almost by 2 times the cost. So what does the future hold for all of us, right? So in my opinion, I've been working a lot in this field, especially when you work in advertisement, especially when you work in prediction of cholera. Predicting correlations is okay if you look at it as almost decision support system. I think all of us should take the next step and actually try to get to causality as much as we can. Thank you so much.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions. Are there any questions online? Any questions?
Sarah, University of Michigan. Obviously, the biggest challenge doing causality using observational data is unmeasured confounding. How did you address that in, 50 applications that you presented?
Right. There's no single answer. So I'll just kind of repeat the different ways we've encountered this before and handled this. We identify correlation, then we'll try to explain from literature. That reduced a lot of spurious correlation, right? That's one way. The other way is a lot of the work that actuaries are doing today, they're doing matching. How do you do matching? There's a lot of way of verifying using different diff methodologies, trend analysis, making sure that the groups that you check retrospectively are behaving very similarly. If you select good treatment control groups, then usually those numbers are correct. Again, there's nothing better than actually doing the experiment. Don't get me wrong. We never got to a point where it's like, okay, You don't need to do treatment control group experiments. The only thing that we can do is reduce those type of spurious correlations. One of them is by somebody else did an experiment. We already know that A causes B, and we want to enter this into the system. But everything else, you kind of need to do better matching behind the scenes.